This house is unlike any other. Everyone who crosses its threshold risks finding themselves somewhere unexpected. Here, time isn't a line but a labyrinth, where the past and future hide behind every door. The only question is, are you ready to step inside? On the outskirts of a small American town stood an old, dilapidated house. The locals avoided it at all costs. Rumor had it that the house didn't stay in one place. It would appear in different locations, as if it were moving through the world. But the strangest part? Time inside the house didn't flow the same as it did outside. Emily, a young college student, had come to visit her Aunt Linda for summer break. Her aunt's house was near the field where the mysterious house sometimes appeared. One evening, while out for a walk, Emily saw the house for the first time. It looked strange. Its facade resembled 19th century architecture, yet it appeared too pristine for its supposed age. The windows seemed like watchful eyes and the door was slightly ajar, as if beckoning her inside. Unable to resist her curiosity, Emily stepped in. As she entered, the air grew thick and heavy. The wooden floor creaked under her feet, radiating warmth, even though the house had no visible source of heat. The interior was vintage yet untouched, as if preserved in time. A brick fireplace stood in the corner, layered with a fine coating of dust. On the wall, an old clock ticked unnervingly fast. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. Emily spun around, but no one was there. An eerie feeling washed over her, as if someone, or something, was watching her. A faint voice echoed from deeper inside the house. Emily. Her heart skipped a beat. How did anyone here know her name? Following the voice, she entered a long hallway lined with paintings. They depicted scenes from various eras. One painting showed her school, but it looked brand new, as though freshly built. Another displayed a towering, futuristic skyscraper that seemed decades ahead of its time. The hallway ended at a door. As she opened it, her world changed entirely. Emily now found herself on the street of a small town. Classic cars rumbled past, and the townsfolk wore clothes from the 1930s. She froze, trying to comprehend what had just happened. A man walked by holding a newspaper. The headline read, July 25th, 1935, storm expected to hit. Emily attempted to speak to the townspeople, but they stared at her as though she didn't belong. Feeling panicked, she ran back toward the house. The door was still open, waiting for her. Once inside, she was back in the hallway, but now the paintings had changed. One of them showed her standing outside the house, her face frozen in fear. The voice returned, louder this time. You must understand who you are. Emily felt the walls around her shift, and suddenly she was hurled into another time. This time she stood in a bleak, smoke-filled city. Cracked streets sprawled beneath towering, decaying buildings. Distant sirens echoed through the air. She stumbled upon a futuristic screen displaying the date. Year 2087, final evacuation of the city. Before she could process it, Emily noticed something horrifying. Her shadow was moving on its own. It seemed to be pulling her forward, deeper into the future. But an overwhelming sense of dread warned her. If she followed, she would never return. Emily turned and bolted back into the house. The corridor warped around her, the paintings flashing like distorted memories. She barely made it into the central room, where an ancient mechanism stood. It was filled with gears and dials, its center marked with the words, "Choose your time." A large lever stood in front of her. On the left side was the word past, and on the right, future. Beneath it was an ominous warning, you cannot stay. Choose, or the house will choose for you. Desperate, Emily grabbed the lever and pushed it forward. A blinding light enveloped her, and the house seemed to dissolve around her. When the light faded, Emily found herself in a massive futuristic city. Hovering vehicles zipped through the air, and the people wore metallic suits, their faces partially obscured by strange visors. She looked up to see a colossal screen displaying the date. December 13th, 2157. Her relief at escaping the house was short-lived. Everyone around her began staring at her with a mix of fear and recognition. One man approached her and whispered, "You shouldn't be here. They're coming for you." In the distance, Emily heard the heavy, rhythmic sound of footsteps. Turning, she saw hooded figures moving toward her. Terrified, she sprinted through the unfamiliar streets until she spotted a familiar door. The same door from the house. Bursting through it, she found herself back in the hallway of paintings. On one of the walls, a new painting appeared. It showed her running through the futuristic city, the hooded figures chasing her. The voice returned. "You've made your choice, but the cycle is not over." The door behind her slammed shut, and the house began to shift once more, carrying her to another place, another time. Ending, Emily woke up on the floor of her aunt's house. Everything was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. She glanced out the window, but the house was gone. For a brief moment, she thought it might have all been a dream. But when she got up and looked in the mirror, she froze. On her wrist was a faint mark, a strange symbol resembling a clock's face, the same symbol she had seen on the hooded figures. As she stared at it, she heard a faint ticking sound coming from inside her head. The voice whispered one last time, "Time does not let go of its own." From that day forward, Emily knew she was marked. No matter how far she ran or how long she waited, the house would return for her. It was only a matter of time. Emily lay awake on her bed, staring at the ceiling in her aunt's house. It felt as though everything she had experienced had been some twisted dream. But the mark on her wrist, the strange ticking sound in her ears, and the deep sense of dread she couldn't shake all proved otherwise. She knew something was wrong. The house had left its mark on her, but why? Suddenly she heard a noise. It was faint at first, like the wind, but it grew louder. The walls seemed to vibrate with an unsettling hum. The clock in her aunt's house, a gift passed down through generations, began ticking rapidly, its hands spinning in circles. Emily shot out of bed and rushed to the window. She could see the familiar silhouette of the house, standing across the field, its door wide open as though inviting her to return. The darkness surrounding it seemed to pulse with energy, and for the first time Emily could feel it. It was calling her. Despite every instinct telling her to run, Emily knew she had no choice. The house was part of her now. There was a connection she couldn't deny. The ticking in her ears grew louder, almost deafening. Her wrist burned with the mark of the clock symbol. She grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold night. The closer Emily got to the house, the more intense the sensation of being pulled in became. It was like the air around her thickened, pressing against her skin. She felt as though she were walking through molasses, each step slower than the last. When she finally reached the front door, it swung open with a loud creak, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Inside, the air was musty and stale, but the house was different now. The paintings in the hallway had changed again, now showing images of Emily, of her as a child, her family, and even her aunt. One image was particularly disturbing. It showed Emily standing at the same door, but the door behind her was completely black, as if it led to a void. She turned away from the painting and stepped into the main room. There, in the center of the floor, stood the same strange mechanism she had encountered before. It was different now, bigger, more menacing, with gears turning at a rapid pace. The clock symbol on her wrist began to glow faintly as she approached. A voice, deep and reverberating, echoed in her mind. "You cannot escape, Emily. The house has chosen you." The voice was everywhere, in her head, in the walls, in the very air she breathed. It was as if the house was alive, watching her every move. Fear gripped her heart, but she didn't have time to question it. She needed answers, and this was the only place she could find them. As Emily moved closer to the mechanism, she saw that the dials on it were labeled with different dates: past, present, future. There were names and locations, some familiar, some completely foreign. She reached out to touch the dials, but the moment her fingers made contact, the floor beneath her began to tremble violently. The walls seemed to warp and twist, and the house groaned as if it were alive, straining against the pressure of time itself. Suddenly, the mechanism spun into motion on its own, faster and faster. The ticking of the clocks grew into a maddening rhythm, and Emily found herself being pulled toward it. It wasn't just the house anymore. The very fabric of time was bending around her. She could feel herself being stretched thin, as if reality itself were tearing at the seams. "Emily!" the voice called out again. But this time it was different. It wasn't just one voice. There were many. It was the voices of the past, the present, and the future, all calling her name at once. In the chaos, Emily realized something. The house wasn't just moving through time. It was manipulating time, using her as a conduit to bend the rules of reality. She wasn't just a visitor in the house. She was its anchor. The mechanism jerked to a stop, and Emily was thrown backward onto the floor. The room seemed to settle, but something had changed. There was an overwhelming silence, broken only by the faintest ticking from a clock somewhere in the distance. Emily struggled to her feet, her body aching from the violent pull of time. As she looked around, she realized that the house had shifted again. The paintings on the walls now showed a horrific scene. A decaying city, buildings falling apart, streets empty. It was a future that had yet to happen, but was now beginning to unfold before her eyes. A figure emerged from the shadows, one of the hooded figures she had seen before. But this time, it was different. This figure was older, its face lined with age, yet its eyes burned with the same emptiness she had seen in the other figures. "You've learned too much," the figure said, its voice cold and unfeeling. "But you cannot stop it. The house will continue. The cycle will continue." Emily backed away, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't fight it. She couldn't stop the house. But there had to be something she could do. As the figure approached, she felt a strange power surge within her. The clock symbol on her wrist began to glow brighter, pulsing with an energy she couldn't understand. In a moment of desperation, Emily grabbed the nearest clock from the wall and smashed it against the floor. The room shook violently, and for a brief moment, everything froze. The figure stopped in its tracks, the ticking sound halted, and the house fell silent. For the first time, Emily felt in control. The house was waiting for her to take the next step, to complete her connection with it. But she wouldn't do it. Not this time. The ground began to tremble again, but this time it wasn't the house. It was Emily. She had broken free, and the house couldn't hold her any longer. The house was losing its grip on time itself. The figures faded into nothingness, and the paintings on the walls became blank. Emily stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily, her body trembling. She felt the tick, tick, tick of time slow down. "You're free," a voice whispered in her ear. "For now." Emily stepped outside into the fresh air, the night sky above her. The house stood behind her, silent and still. For the first time, she felt truly free. But somewhere, deep within her, she knew this wasn't the end. The house would always be waiting, and time, as always, would continue.